Have you ever believed something for years only to discover it wasn't true? Not because anyone lied to you, or maybe they did, but not because you weren't paying attention, but because you'd heard it so many times, lived it for so long, or repeated it so often that it stopped feeling like a belief and started feeling like a fact. It's an interesting part of being human. The longer we carry an idea, the more familiar it becomes. And the more familiar it becomes, the less likely we are to question it. That's true of our opinions. It's true of our habits. And it's true of the stories we tell ourselves. And sometimes it's even true of our identity. Today, I'd like to take that idea one step further. Because if we're going to let go of what's no longer serving us, we first have to ask an important question. How do we know what deserves to stay? And then, how do we know what's true? One of the signs of maturity isn't that we never change our minds. It's that you're willing to change your mind when new information deserves a new conclusion. Let me repeat that. It's that you're willing to change your mind when new information deserves a new conclusion. And maybe that's the real challenge. Not defending what we've always believed and not proving ourselves right, but remaining curious enough to keep learning. Because the goal isn't to prove ourselves right. The goal is to get closer to what's true. And if that's true, then today's conversation has the potential to change much more than your mind. It may change the way you think. Are you ready? I am. I'm Jonah. I'm your person. Let's get to it. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment to welcome our listeners joining us from around the world. Whether you're listening in Australia, Germany, South Africa, Brazil, Japan, Mexico, India, or somewhere else across the 76 countries that now make up this incredible community, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you more than you know. Now, let's talk about something all human beings have in common. We like certainty. We like knowing. We like feeling confident that we've figured something out. And there isn't anything wrong with that. The challenge is that certainty can sometimes arrive before understanding does. Think about it. How many things do you believe simply because we've heard them enough times? Not because we've researched them, not because we've tested them, and not because we've examined them, but because they've become familiar. Familiarity has a funny effect on the human mind. The longer we live with an idea, the less likely we are to question it. And eventually, we stop seeing it as just a simple belief. We start seeing it as reality. That's true of things we believe about ourselves, too. It's true of the things we believe about other people. It's true of the assumptions we make about life. And once an idea crosses that line, something interesting happens. We stop investigating it. We stop being curious about it. And we stop asking questions. And that's where growth can quietly come to a halt. Because curiosity is one of the engines of higher level thinking. The moment we stop asking questions, we stop discovering new answers. So, let me ask you one. What is something you've believed for so long that you've never stopped to ask whether it's actually true? Don't answer it. Just hold on to the question. Because where we're headed next may surprise you. Let's continue with that thought here in part 2. Have you ever noticed how children ask questions about everything? Just a quick side note. As a kid, I was horrible. Well, maybe horrible is too strong of a word. I was always asking my mom, why? And she realized after she told me, because I told you so, that I would go do what I was supposed to do, came back, and I still ask why. And I think she realized at that point how important it was for my growth and development to respond kindly and to tell me why I needed to do something. Because it wasn't just what she told me to do, I was asking her why questions about my brother and my sister about why do they do this or do they have to go do that or whatever the case might be. I was always asking why, and I'll tell you what, that hasn't changed that much as an adult. Now I self-regulate, so I'm not just going around walking and talking to people, why? But even in my current role that requires me to ask a lot of why questions, I think being a little kid and curious set me up for success in that way. But here are some questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do birds fly? Why do people do that? Why? Why? At some point, most of us stopped asking so many questions. Not because we became less intelligent, but because we became more certain. And certainty can be useful. Imagine having to question every single decision you make throughout the day. You never get anything done. And the problem isn't certainty itself. The problem is when certainty becomes automatic. When we stop asking questions, not because we found the answer, but because we've become comfortable with the answer we already have. That's when assumptions quietly move in. We assume we know who we are. We assume we know what other people are thinking. We assume we know what we're capable of. And we assume we know what's possible. And often, we never revisit those assumptions. Think about that for a moment. Some of the beliefs we're carrying today may have been formed years ago, maybe even decades ago, when you were younger, less experienced, working with less information than you have now. Yet many people continue operating from conclusions they reached long ago. Not because those conclusions are accurate, but because they were never challenged. One of the signs of maturity isn't that you never change your mind. It's that you're willing to change your mind when new information deserves a new conclusion. That's growth. That's wisdom. And that's one of the reasons curiosity is so powerful. Because curiosity gives us permission to revisit what we've assumed. And sometimes when we do, we discover something surprising. The belief was never true. It was simply familiar. Let's explore that a little bit more in the next part. Okay, let's take this one step further. Because some of the most powerful beliefs we carry aren't about the world. They're about ourselves. And those can be some of the hardest ones to see. Think about some of the things people say. I'm not a leader. I'm bad with money. I'm not creative. I'm not smart enough. I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm just not that kind of person. Have you ever noticed how confidently people say those things? As if they're reading some facts from a report? As if the matter has already been decided? But how often do we stop and ask where those beliefs came from? Maybe someone said something years ago. Maybe a teacher, maybe a parent, maybe a friend, maybe one difficult experience, or maybe one failure. Maybe one embarrassing moment. Whatever the source, the belief gets repeated, then repeated again and again. And over time, it becomes familiar. And eventually, something important happens. The belief stops feeling like a belief. It starts feeling like identity. And that's when familiar becomes powerful. Because once something becomes part of your identity, we stop evaluating it. We defend it. We build around it. We make decisions from it. And we organize our lives around it and make decisions that may not be in alignment with the truth. More times than not, it's not. And the frightening part of that is some of those identities may have been built on incomplete information. A moment, an opinion, a misunderstanding, or a chapter, but not the whole story. This is why curiosity matters so much. Curiosity allows us to revisit conclusions we've made about ourselves. It gives us permission to ask, is this really who I am? Or is this simply a story I've carried for a very long time? Because sometimes the biggest limitation in our lives isn't the lack of ability. It's an old identity that we've mistaken for the truth. Let's talk about how to challenge that next. So how do we challenge a belief we've carried for years? We start with a question. Not a complicated question, not a philosophical question, just an honest one. How do I know that's true? Think about how powerful that question really is. Because most beliefs never get tested. They get repeated. And repetition can create the illusion of truth. The more often we hear something, the more normal it feels. And the more normal it feels, the less likely we are to question it. But familiar and true are not the same thing. Let's say someone believes, I'm not good enough. How do they know it's true? What evidence are they using? One failure? One rejection? One bad season of life? Let's say someone believes, I'll never be successful. How do they know that's true? Have they seen the future? Or have they simply repeated the same conclusion long enough and it stopped feeling like a conclusion and started feeling like a fact? This is one of the reasons curiosity is so important. Curiosity disrupts and interrupts certainty or assumptions. Curiosity creates space. Curiosity allows us to consider possibilities we couldn't see before. And perhaps that's what higher level thinking is really about. Not having all the answers, being willing to ask better questions. So here's your first challenge for the week. Choose one belief you've been carrying about yourself. Just one. Then ask, how do I know that's true? Don't defend it. Don't argue for it. Don't justify it. Simply investigate it. Look at it with fresh eyes, because you may discover what you've been calling the truth is actually an assumption. And if that's the case, it opens the door to a different future. Let's explore what becomes possible when that door opens. Before we get into part 5, I just wanted to thank you so much again for being here. Whether you've been listening since the beginning or this is your very first episode, I'm grateful you're spending this time with me. And if you're enjoying the podcast, make sure you're following or subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you think someone could benefit from today's message, and I think there's plenty of people out there that can, share the episode with them. You can also find me on social media for additional content throughout the week. Now, back to the show. Here in part 5, we're going to talk about the freedom of changing your mind and how freeing it is when you know the truth. Let's talk about something that makes so many people uncomfortable: changing your mind. For some reason, we've been taught that changing our minds is a sign of weakness, that if we revise an opinion, reconsider a belief, or adopt a new perspective, it means that we're doing wrong. But what if that's backwards? What if the willingness to change your mind is actually a sign of growth? Think about it. Imagine meeting someone who believes exactly the same things they believed 10 years ago. The same opinions, the same assumptions, the same conclusions, without a single update, without a single revision, or without a single new perspective. Would that be wisdom? Or would that be stagnation? Look, life changes, people change, information changes, and experience changes us as well. Why should our thinking remain frozen? One of the signs of maturity isn't that you never change your mind, as I said a few minutes ago. It's that you're willing to change your mind when new information deserves a new conclusion. I'm going to be repeating that over and over and over again because this is new, right? It's important to challenge the status quo, particularly if it's not true. That's not weakness. That's intellectual honesty. That's curiosity. That's growth. And perhaps that's where many people get stuck. Not because they're incapable of learning, but because they've attached their identity to being right. The moment being right becomes more important than discovering what's true, curiosity starts to disappear. Questions become threats. New information becomes an enemy. Different perspectives become something to defeat rather than to understand. And that's the purpose of higher level thinking. Higher level thinking isn't about collecting beliefs and defending them. It's about remaining curious enough to keep refining them. Because the goal isn't to prove ourselves right. The goal is to get closer to what's true. And the closer we get to the truth, the more freedom we gain. Freedom from assumptions. Freedom from outdated conclusions. Freedom from beliefs that no longer fit in who we've become. Maybe that's why changing your mind can feel uncomfortable. Not because you're losing something, but because you're growing beyond it. And sometimes growth requires us to release certainty in exchange for understanding. Let's see what happens when we put the idea into practice. All right, let's make this practical. Because it's one thing to talk about beliefs. It's another thing to experience what happens when we challenge them. Imagine carrying around a pair of glasses your entire life. You put them on when you were young. You became accustomed to them. You forgot that they were even there. And over time, you stopped seeing the glasses. You only saw the world through them. That's how many beliefs work. We don't realize we're looking through them. We think we're looking at reality. And that's why two people can experience the same event and walk away with completely different conclusions. It's why two people can hear the same information and arrive at different interpretations. It's why one person sees opportunity while another sees risk. Neither person is necessarily seeing the world as it is. They're seeing it through the lens they've developed over time. Now, here's the important question. What happens when we intentionally try on a different lens? Not forever, just for a moment, and just long enough to explore. What if the thing you've been assuming about yourself isn't actually true? What if you're more capable than you've given yourself credit for? What if the opportunity you've dismissed is actually worth pursuing? What if the person you've judged deserves another look? And what if the fear you've been carrying is based on outdated conclusions? Notice something? I'm not asking you to immediately believe the opposite. I'm asking you to become curious. That's a very big difference. Curiosity doesn't demand certainty. Curiosity simply says, let's take another look. And that's where transformation often begins. Not when we force ourselves to adopt a new belief, but when we become willing to explore the possibility that another perspective exists. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in life happen because someone was willing to ask, what if I'm looking at this all the wrong way? Not because they knew the answer, but because they were willing to question the question. So here's your challenge for this week, your second one. Pick one belief, or an assumption, or even a conclusion you've been carrying forever. Then spend the next 7 days acting as if maybe another one exists. You don't have to replace the belief, and you don't have to reject it. Just explore it. Have the courage, have the audacity to move forward. Ask the questions, gather your evidence, but stay curious. Because sometimes the life-changing breakthrough isn't found in a new answer. It's found in a new perspective. And that brings us to the one final idea I'd like to leave you with. As we begin to wrap up this conversation, I'd like to leave you with one final idea. Stay curious. Not because curiosity makes you smarter, and not because curiosity makes you more successful, but because curiosity keeps you growing. The moment we become absolutely certain that we figured everything out, we stop learning. We stop exploring. We stop discovering. And in many ways, we stop expanding. That's one of the reasons why curiosity is such an important part of higher level thinking. It creates space between what we know and what we think we know. It reminds us that there may be more to the story, more to the situation, more to that person, or more to ourselves. Think about how different the world would be if more people approached life with curiosity instead of certainty. What if we spent less time defending our positions and more time trying to understand them? What if we spent less time trying to win arguments and more time trying to learn something? What if we became just a little more interested in understanding than being understood? Those questions matter because the quality of our lives is often influenced by the quality of questions we ask. And some of the most important questions we'll ever ask are directed inward. Why do I believe this? Where did this belief come from anyway? Does it still serve me? Is it true? Those questions require courage because sometimes the answers surprise us. Sometimes they challenge us. Sometimes they invite us to grow. But growth has always required courage. And maybe that's the real invitation of today's episode. Not to abandon everything you believe and not to question every thought you've ever had. Simply to remain open. Open to learning. Open to growth. Open to the possibility that there's still more to discover. Because familiar and true are not the same thing. And the moment we recognize the difference, we give ourselves permission to become something more. Let's bring it home now. You know, one of the things I've learned over the years is that life has a way of humbling all of us, not in a cruel way, and not in a punishing way, but in a way that reminds us that none of us have everything figured out. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. Because the moment we believe we reach the end of our learning, we stop growing. We stop listening. We stop discovering. We put up walls. We stop allowing ourselves to become more than we were yesterday. Today's conversation wasn't really about beliefs. It wasn't really about assumptions. And it wasn't really about being right. It was about remaining open. Open to new information. Open to new experiences. Open to the possibility that there may be more to learn. And I think some of the most remarkable people you'll ever meet have one thing in common. They're teachable. No matter how successful they become, no matter how much experience they have, and no matter how much they've accomplished, they remain students of life. They continue asking questions. They continue learning. And they continue growing. And maybe that's something worth striving for. Not perfection, not certainty, not having all the answers. Just willing to keep learning. A willingness to keep examining. A willingness to keep growing. Because when we do that, something interesting happens. The world gets bigger. Because people become more interesting. Opportunities become more visible. And we start seeing possibilities that were there all along. So this week, if you find yourself holding tightly to an opinion or a belief or a conclusion, you don't have to immediately let it go. Just hold it a little bit more gently. Look at it. Examine it. Ask questions about it. And remember, the goal isn't to prove ourselves right. The goal is to get closer to what's true. And that pursuit may be one of the most worthwhile journeys we'll ever take. Thanks so much for spending part of your day with me. And thank you for being willing to think a little deeper with me each week. For now, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for coming back. And have a great week.